right, let us begin. Let us begin. We are slowly coming to the end. Wrestling with American democracy, the multi-dimensional, multi-layered argument that we've been trying to put forward. And I want to begin with some meditation on the historical significance of 49 years ago and 2 days in the history of this empire, and how it raises the question that I started this class with, which was Plato's question. It's a question that's on the syllabus for this week. Can the people rule? We had to be very, very cautious and careful when we talk about democracy, as if we just assume that there's been adequate arguments against Plato's claim that the people could never rule because of their unruly passion and their ubiquitous ignorance that would result in tyranny. And 49 years ago in 2 days in the history of American democracy, the death of Martin Luther King Jr. It's easy to skip over it. 150 cities burning. First time since the Civil War that the National Guard was brought out to defend the White House. And when Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said the future of America depends on the impact of Martin Luther King Jr. and America's response to the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., that question, that courageous question by Rabbi Heschel, continues to haunt us. Now, we are blessed today to have one of the most distinguished legal minds and professors of law at Georgetown with us. His name is Anthony Cook, Anthony Earl Cook, with a degree from Princeton, honors, Yale Law, honors, deeply rooted in the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote a very pivotal essay in 1990 in the Harvard Law Review on Beyond Critical Legal Studies, going back, a reconstructive reflection on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. Just raise your hand. Give it up for our dear brother, Professor Anthony Earl Cook. And it's a blessing to see him. We go all the way back to the New Haven years when he was a student at Yale Law, and he's had me in a number of different contexts. But he knows very much of what I'm talking about because he's wrestling with the same question. Can the people rule? What we saw 49 years ago was precisely the inability of America to muster the existential capacity among its various citizens, the civic capacity to highlight public interest rather than personal gain, and the institutional capacity, especially at the level of political parties, to come to terms with the plight of what Martin Luther King Jr. was focusing on: poor people of all colors, working poor of all colors, and the military-industrial complex, the imperial machine that goes hand in hand with the rule of elites in American democracy. Massive failure. Massive failure. 49 years later. And we could say 50 years later in terms of Martin Luther King Jr.'s historic speech at Riverside Church, breaking the silence. Same issues. Poverty, ruling elite, massive transfer of wealth upward. But most importantly, and this is where Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the great American prophets, like Ralph Waldo Emerson, like Walt Whitman, like Herman Melville, like Muriel Rukeyser, like Rabbi Heschel, like Edward Said, truth tellers. How do we focus on forms of soulcraft having to do with the character of the people, the virtues enacted by the people, the values promoted by the people? So when we say, can the people rule? That's not a political question, so profoundly moral. I would argue it's profoundly spiritual. And the space where Martin Luther King Jr. resides, similar to Emerson and Melville, is a space where He is fundamentally concerned about whether there's enough integrity distributed among the citizenry. Is there enough courage distributed among the citizenry? Is there enough decency? Is there enough fortitude? Of course, we've talked about fortitude in terms of the courage and the magnanimity and greatness of character, you see. And that is a personal, institutional, ideological, educational, and spiritual question, all at the same time. And I think one of the challenges for us, especially here at Harvard, especially in an educational institution, is do we have forms of soulcraft that are emerging in our educational institutions to produce those kinds of people? So it's not just a matter of being spectators and crying crocodile tears about, let's say, the assassination of Martin King, but saying, how can I best build on that legacy in my own distinct way relative to who I am, the voices that I can promote, the voices that I have, the organizations that I can be a part of. And I think we do have to be honest. And again, this is not so much a question of my presentation, because these last few weeks we're trying to be much more dialogical and conversational, because I want to hear from you. But it just strikes me that the market-driven soulcraft that is dominant in this society, in this generation, makes it very difficult to provide the kind of answer to Plato that would put a smile on Martin Luther King Jr.'s face from the grave. Now, what do you mean by that, Brother West? Well, when I see the levels of conformity in professional managerial cultures, when I see the levels of conformity in universities and colleges that are pre-professional, people can't wait to get their careers off the ground, but not enough reflection about their callings. They can't wait to be professionals without serious reflection about their vocations. They can't wait to gain access to the mainstream, as if the mainstream is the soul stream. No, the mainstream is just a stream among a whole host of other streams. There are counter streams against the mainstream that might have something to do with your calling and vocation as opposed to just your career and your profession. How do we open up these ways of thinking about being in this empire, this democracy, in such a way that people have access to those kinds of vocations and can live, can embody, can enact those vocations and still survive? And still survive. Because all the talk in the world, myself, Professor Unger, yourself, and others, at this abstract level of critiques of the empire, critiques of capitalism, critiques of white supremacy, male supremacy, anti-Jewish, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-gay, lesbian, trans, all the stuff that you often hear in universities, how is it translated on the ground if the dominant form of soulcraft is still to move one into these mainstreams in which these dialogues simply become decorative for the social structure still in place, become ornamental for the same class structure, same imperial policy still in place? And of course, the other option is what? Opting out, self-medication, addiction, drugs, sexual activity, or addiction to success by any means, obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught. In this Trump moment is the structural and institutional embodiment of that kind of nihilism. Greed, corruption, mendacity, lies, crimes hidden and concealed, and thinking you can get away with it precisely because we live in an age of impunity. Nobody's rendering accountable in any substantial way. There's no answerability in any substantial way. And the end result is what? Plato's Republic. Tyranny emerging out of the collapse of a precious democratic experiment in the name of democracy. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. comes out of a tradition in which he had been dealing with what de Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority from the very beginning. Black folk in America has had to deal with the authoritarian face of American democracy, the crypto-fascist face of American democracy, all the way through, up until this very moment. Even given the wonderful presence of the chocolate folk here at Harvard, don't believe the hype. Just go to the hood, go to the prison industrial complex, go to the decrepit schools, and see precisely what Martin Luther King Jr. gave his life for. The humanity of those who have been dishonored, devalued, demeaned, and institutionally and structurally, no alternatives available for that democratizing of market, the deepening of democracy, all the good stuff that we have been talking about. And so one of the reasons why I've been coming back to this issue of hope and Thucydides on hope, why it could be dangerous, and it's a comfort in danger rather than an empowerment in crisis. And how do we somehow create institutional capacities to generate different kinds of soulcraft? I think it can be done at Harvard. It can be done in educational institutions, but it's going to be countercultural. It's going to be countervailing. And that's one of the reasons why we work and teach it. In the same way, in your own individual lives, how do you muster the courage to examine your own formation, who you are, intellectually, morally, culturally, politically, so that you take seriously the legacies of the Kings and the Heschels and the Zaids and the Rookeisers and others? And that question can only be answered like the conclusion of a practical Aristotelian syllogism, a life lived. Not in terms of what you talk about, not in terms of the words that come out of your mouth, but in terms of actions, deeds, orientations, quality of empathy, quality of courage, and the kind of organizations and structures you choose to be affiliated with, you choose to be a part of. Now we'll talk a little bit more about this People's Party that many of us are working on now, given the decline of what many of us perceive as the milquetoast, mediocre Democratic Party and the cold-hearted, mean-spirited Republican Party. But that's at a political level of institutional capacity. How do you translate democratic alternatives when it comes to contesting for power vis-a-vis the nation state? But it's so easy to jump to that particular moment and not deal with the existential moment and the civic moment. Personal moment on the one hand, who we are, who are the people, and can the people rule? Can you rule your own soul when the careerism and the opportunism come at you? Can you rule your own self when your gangster proclivities more and more become hegemonic rather than your loving and courageous proclivities do? That civil war that's waging on the soul of every human being. That's a personal question. We don't reside solely at the existential and personal, but it is not to be downplayed at all. When Martin Luther King Jr. used to tell his staff, I would rather be dead than afraid. That's a personal and existential stance. Don't come out against the war. It's going to pull the rug from under civil rights. What did he say? Whitney Young, that might get you a corporate sponsor, but it won't get you a foothold in the kingdom of truth. Just think of Martin's words in regard to your own lives. Context, the context, the context. and then, of course, the tradition that produced him, which these days is weaker and feeble, with the example of the magnificent new militancy with the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter and so forth. Themselves not perfect in their enactment, but very tied to integrity, empathy, and courage, not just in the national context, but with the international context as well, looking to Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and so forth. So let me stop there and open it up for questions, though. Yes, jump right in. Everybody hear that question? Self-love and self-trust certainly are preconditions for trying to love others, have empathy for others, have compassion for others. Is that a fair characterization of your comments and questions? Right. Absolutely. And the thing is, if people have not raised that Socratic question until they're about to graduate from law school, exactly, that's what you call a feed. That's a late comer. Because that's the fundamental question. Why would you even go to college? Why would you go to a law school if you don't already have a sense of your sense of who you are and how these forms of weaponry can be used to help both you and people you have deep connection and solidarity to? If one allows oneself to be incorporated and shaped and constructed by the dominant values, and the dominant values at Harvard Law, oh my God, you know better than I do. It's monetary, pecuniary, it's status, it's so, you know, that's the worst of the human spirit. It is. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to be smart, but smart means nothing without wisdom and compassion. And Nazis are smart. Gangsters are smart. Thugs are smart. So what? But the challenge is this. I think you do have to go outside of yourself. That's why I spend so much time talking about Emerson in my text. In Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, he's got a three-part move. The first thing he said, self-reliance is an aversion to conformity. It's over against conformity. The second move is trying to get outside of yourself, but not outside of yourself vis-a-vis dominant hegemonic forms of being socialized. We all need exemplars. That's why I invoke Martin. He read Plutarch's Lives. He read Samuel Johnson's Lives of the Poets. You wrote Representative Men of Plato and Montaigne. You have to get outside of yourself in history, the Sankofa sensibility, being connected with the best of your past. For me, it's King and Coltrane, and I just saw Cassandra Wilson. Here's her picture, right here. I just saw her this morning, just ran into it. Just, you know, for me, it's providential. Probably others, it's just serendipity. I got a chance to see Cassandra Wilson. She's one of the few artists alive who put a smile on the face of Sarah Vaughan and Carmen McRae and Ella Fitzgerald at the same time. She exemplifies a level of integrity, of honesty, of courage, adventure, a willingness to get outside of themselves in service to others. exemplars are fundamental. The only way we get outside of our narcissism is either to be socialized into a mainstream or to be over against. You see? And therefore, when we talk about this, what I'm calling this soul craft, democratic soul craft, and the Emersonian, James Baldwin's another great example of this, democratic soul craft over against the conformity, complacency, and the cowardice. Because believe me, for the most part, to be able to ascend to the highest levels of Wall Street, well, I'm sure there's some decent people there in a certain sense in relation to their families and so on. The level of callousness and indifference to poor people that is presupposed given the unbelievable wealth that is derived all the time while people are barely making it. You've got to learn how to turn your back. You got to learn how to become a way of life such that you're not concerned about those folk in the prisons and so on. And you come up with all kind of rationalizations. You get a little guilty and give a little philanthropy, especially if the building is named after you. Oh, the selfishness is still operating. I'm just so good. So that's pity. That's not impact. That's not compassion. You see, so that examples become the second move, and the third move is you've got to be part of spaces, zones, countercultures that reinforce what we're talking about, because the dominant society, the dominant orientation is so powerful, it will seduce you. It will easily suck you in. It will easily dampen your fire for justice. It will easily convince you, especially as you get closer to mortality, as your body gets closer to the worms. Oh my God, I only got one lifetime. Maybe all this talk about courage and integrity is just too much. I need to just cut back on some of that. I want to not just compromise. I want to give in, which is a form of giving up, which is a form in the end of spiritual blackout. And that has become predominant. That has become predominant. So that I'm glad they're raising the question, but to raise it right before people graduate, ooh, that's late. Brother Anthony and I talked about this way back in 1988. And he was first-year student at Yale up from Princeton. And I just started teaching. My first question to the brother, he's come out of Mississippi, so he got a jump start in life. Jump start in life coming out of Mississippi. Gut bucket Jim Crow, Mississippi, you know what I mean? And Mississippi has produced more literary artists in the state of Massachusetts. There's no William Faulkner coming out of Boston. There's no Tennessee Williams coming out of Boston. There's no Lillian Smith coming out of Boston. There's no B.B. King coming out of Boston. We can go on and on. We ain't got to B.B. We haven't even got to vanilla side of town with Elvis Presley. When it comes to popular music, we got Tennessee and Faulkner and the other. So Mississippi got something going on. Then they got a whole lot of Negroes catching hell in Mississippi. Levels of violence, suffering, misery, unbelievable. In the Delta with the blues, the Robert Johnsons and others. The first question was, who are you? What you going to do with your life? What's your vocation? How you going to put a smile on your mama's face? Now, you at Yale Law, don't tell me what firm you're concerned. Don't tell me what professors yet. Let's just keep it basic first, and we'll get to the other stuff. 30, 20-some years later, we raise the same questions. We're going to break bread tonight for hours. Same questions. Keeping each other answerable, accountable, mediated with deep love and compassion. Ain't that right, though, brother? That's it. That makes a difference. That makes a difference. And there's no plaything. There's no plaything at all. Because we have tons of friends who we love deeply who have sold their souls for a mess of pottage. Is that right? And we just have to tell them and say, we're praying for you. No envy, we're just praying for you. You know what I mean? If you want to make big money and be mainstream, okay, that's your thing, that's fine. That's fine. And see what kind of legacy you leave on the ground. Everyday people. Those are the kind of queries that each and every one of us have to wrestle with. And no one of us have a monopoly on truth or goodness or beauty. We all fall short. But you have to wrestle with. I know there's some other questions before we move on. Yeah, that's about it. Absolutely. Mhm. Well, one is that these narratives, and these are embodied narratives again, they're just not words on a page, but they're lives lived and various stories that flow from these lives. That's when I talk about exemplars, and I did invoke individuals, but I'm also talking about movements. I'm also talking about groups. I'm talking about families. I'm talking about exemplary synagogues, exemplary temples, exemplary churches, exemplary trade unions, exemplary civic formations. You see what I mean? So the exemplarity is not confined just to individuals and personages. It flows over into a broader sense. And they live these narratives. They live these narratives. We talk about Ella Baker. There's no Ella Baker without SNCC and SCLC and NAACP and so forth. You see. And her work is inseparable from telling stories and narratives about those institutions and movements that shaped her just as she shaped them. And so the first move is to attempt to become part of the very stories in one's own embodied existence. You see. So that, for example, let's say here at Harvard, they got wonderful professors in various ways, magnificent students in various ways, but you always want a town-gown dialectic working. You got to get some distance from the bubble. And in getting distance from the bubble, you have some engagement in what's going on in the community where the stories themselves are being enacted all the time. And they're very different than some of the stories and narratives that are told in the university, given its variety and heterogeneity. I don't want to ever assume that Harvard, any other institution, only has one or two dominant stories. There's a lot of different stories that are floating around, but the question is, can you measure them in terms of integrity facing oppression, in terms of honesty facing deception, in terms of decency facing insult and courage facing brute force? Those fundamental questions that we started this class with. Du Bois's questions. So that the important thing is being immersed in lived experience communities where these stories are being enacted all the time. So it's not just a cerebral affair. It's something that you're exerting your energy and you're being in some way challenged and unsettled by. Does that make sense to you? Any other questions or comments? If not, you don't hesitate to jump in if you want. Yes, my dear brother, Suraj. Well, impunity, yes. That's right. Mm, mm. Yeah, I think it has so much to do with all of us are linguistic organisms, mindful of the fact that we face bodily extinction very soon. And so we have fears, insecurities, and anxieties. And we have to be socialized in such a way that we come to terms with those fears, insecurities, and anxieties. The reason why democratic ideals are so sublime to many of us is because they do attempt to somehow keep track of the rich humanity of each and every one of the individuals with those fears, insecurities, and anxieties in such a way that there's a better chance that the vulnerable will live lives that flourish than under any other alternative social arrangements. So what informs so much of what Brother Roberto and I, Professor Unger and I have been talking about when he talks about the extraordinary and the ordinary and the greatness in what seems to be littleness is this Pascalian leap of faith in the capacity of Joel James Cleveland called ordinary people to be able to lift their voices and shape the destinies of institutions that guide and regulate their lives. And that therefore, the question then becomes, how do we generate democratic modes of being in the world, democratic ways of being in the world that can sustain democratic institutions? Education, culture, and of course the crucial role of the arts. I know we've been coming back to that over and over again, but I cannot say enough about that. Or Brother Braxton Cook, the son of Brother Anthony, plays the saxophone and puts a smile on John Coltrane's face. That's how deep his son is. That's how deep he is. But he comes out of the same tradition that he does. You see. This brother right here just gave a magnificent, Brother James gave a magnificent reading of John Coltrane. Same tradition. Democratic ways of being in the world, in which the dignity of ordinary people generate an extraordinary voice that people must take heed of for their souls to be touched in such a way that they become more courageous, critical, and service-oriented. Now, how do you do that? Especially these days, in a declining empire in which the culture itself, especially corporate media, is so thoroughly driven by greed and myopia and short-sightedness. On the internet and so forth, countervailing voices, yes, indeed. I don't want to downplay that as well. But again, the only answer I have to you is the various exemplars have to become contagious. They have to become much more highly attractive and appealing. That shatters the callousness and indifference. Thank God for the courts. We've got some courageous judges vis-a-vis Trump's presidency. So far with these bans against these precious so-called undocumented immigrants. You see. That's taking a stand. At that point, liberals can play an important role, but to have some commitment to rights and liberties under a liberal rule of law. Force for good when you've got authoritarians who are trying to rule and expand their rule, you see. So the context is one in which it's not ever going to be one small group of people who's doing all of the good stuff. There's different ways in which people are intervening in this way. Does that begin to get at you? I mean, all we can do is call for massive moral, spiritual, and political awakenings. I mean, that's what democratic education is. How do you get people to become more awakened? And of course, we can't assume that once people shatter their sleepwalking, sometimes when you awake, what happens? You look around and say, it's a bigger nightmare than I thought. Maybe it's better to go back to sleep. See, that's Kafka. That's Eugene O'Neill. When you really wake up and you see what you're up against, and you see how weak the real courageous and critical and compassionate ones are, whatever makes you think you can win. Maybe ignorance is bliss. That's part of the democratic conversation, too. Thank you, Franz Kafka, for that, because your love is still oppositional. You just can't conceive of how human beings are ever going to respond in any powerful way. Kafka says there's hope for God and none for us. That's something to wrestle with. He's not like Plato. He says it as a radical Democrat. Plato says it as an authoritarian. But Kafka's still making the point. That's a crucial point. Beckett, too. I mean, we can go on and on in terms of the challenges here, you see. So we can't just assume just because you waken people that lo and behold, they're on the way to becoming folks concerned with the weak, the vulnerable, and so forth. No, not at all. Not at all. That's the first step. Crucial step, but the first step. That prophecy that Brother Roberto talks about tied to memory. Sometimes that prophecy hit up against a stone wall, given the circumstances. I don't want to end on a bleak note, though, but yes, my dear sister. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, you're using this distinction that Brother Roberto trotted out the other day. We might have to ask you to say a little bit more about that, about the biological time versus the historical time, biographical time and the biographical time and historical time. Because, you see, I would argue that as important as the past is, as important as the future is, the present is crucial too. And that integrity, honesty, and decency are distributed across those three dimensions of time. That you can find, and by artists, I'm not just talking about versifiers, I'm talking about artists of living. You can find it in the present. And you can learn not just to live prospectively, but you can see exemplars in the present who become sources of inspiration to create a better and different alternative future. So there's a dialectical interplay between this biographical time and this historical time. I mean, the biographical time is simply the acknowledgement of our finitude, our radical finitude, intense finitude, and yet still tremendous possibility within our finitude. I wouldn't argue there's an infinite possibility in our finitude. I know that's kind of language Roberto uses sometimes. And I always try to push him on that because I don't think there's infinite possibility inside of any of us. But I think it's so broad, but it's still finite. And therefore, we understand we're just these very brief moments within historical time, which is long range. It goes on and on before, and then we don't know how long after. It could be that, Trump could push the button tonight. This just be the last law school class that we ever had together. You just don't know. I mean, the future is always uncertain. It's contingent just like the present. You see. But given that, that shouldn't in any way disempower us. I do share that with Roberto. It's a matter of not being debilitated because we're finite. It's not meaning we don't have a sense of will, creativity, a sense of adventure, boldness, courage, fortitude. It ought to give us even more so given our finite character in regard to the kind of organisms we are. Did that begin to get at your question now? You think so? Okay. I saw one more hand. Was it over here? Yes, yeah. Well, one, I mean, we're talking about the difference between pity and compassion, the difference between charity and justice, or philanthropy and justice. Pity and charity, still some sign that the moral conscience has not completely blacked out. So there's still some sensitivity. So when you see people suffering, the children suffering and so forth, giving money, that's still a sign that you have some connection and you care. I don't want to downplay that at all. That's better than just a cold-heartedness and a turning one's back and being callous and indifferent. But at the same time, when you're awakened the way radical Democrats, the Dewey and others want us to awaken, you say, well, wait a minute, what are the conditions under which we have to even engage in this kind of charity? And what are the ways in which, as William Blake says, pity itself victimizes? You think you're actually helping, but you're actually engaging sometimes in a self-indulgent form of arrogant giving that reproduces you still on the top and not examining the conditions under which the hierarchy is in place in the first place. That's the problem. And hence, you don't downplay the charity. I'm glad that David Koch gave all that big money for the ballet. I like ballet when I have time. Can't get to the jazz club. I go to some ballet. But I know who David Koch is. He's a right-wing brother. And he's playing a crucial role in the reproduction of class hierarchy, imperial hierarchy, and so forth. Thank you for your dollars, Mr. Koch. You're still dangerous. Spiritually, morally, politically, and so forth. Yes, one last question here. Yeah, I mean, there's the matter. You got to put a spotlight on it. Make sure that spotlight is as widely accessible as possible. We've talked about drone strikes in this class. 45 under Bush and over 500 under Obama. To put a spotlight on it. Make it widely accessible. People know what's going on. And you have to be morally consistent. There's a lot of talk now about these innocent civilians, very precious ones in Syria and other places, who are being killed by both U.S. strikes and Russian strikes. And we know that's not new. That's been going on for a long time. I heard yesterday, I think President Trump says, I was just so moved when I heard that the children had been killed. I said, oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. How many children have been killed by U.S. drone strikes? He didn't say a mumbling word where over 500 Palestinian children were killed in 50 days. And he's not alone. Not one elite in the country did. Hardly any elites in any other spheres did. Well, if you're going to be concerned about the children, those Palestinian children are just as precious as those children in Syria or the children in Turkey or the children in Newtown, Connecticut or any other place. And I'd say the same thing about the children in Tel Aviv when they're killed innocently. Those are crimes against humanity too. You see them? But you have to be morally consistent. So that when you bring to bear any charges of accountability, you have to have some moral authority. And if you've been silent here for so long, then when you bring a critique to bear, it doesn't have a lot of ethical weight because you were not constant in your concern about the suffering. That's what integrity is. That's what Martin Luther King Jr. sacrificed when he said, following that cross meant the death of his popularity, the death of his sponsorship, the death of he being authorized by so many liberals in the mainstream. But he saw the hypocrisy. He saw just how short-sighted they were. He saw how selective they were in terms of the particular victims they wanted to highlight and overlook other kinds of victims. I think you ought to jump right in.
I will.
Mm-hmm.
I had intended to speak today to the reorganization of education and of democratic politics. Two major themes of our argument about American alternatives. But I've changed my mind. Because, and instead, what I'd like to do in this part of the class is, within the space of half an hour, to suggest an overview of the argument of the course up to now, from my standpoint, from the standpoint of my interventions, without professing to summarize Cornell's position. I'm provoked to do this first because we have given you an assignment now at the end of the course to write a paper engaging the argument. And we want this engagement to be an opportunity for you to develop your voice and your position. We don't expect you to engage the argument as a whole. Nevertheless, in engaging a part of the argument, it's important that you have a view of the whole. And that leads me to the second factor that provokes me to present a conception of the whole of the argument. What changes the world always is the marriage of exemplary action with visionary thinking and teaching. And in visionary thinking and teaching, an indispensable element is the idea, the conception, the doctrine. There is no replacement for thought. Ideas alone do not change the world, but without ideas, it is impossible to change the world. And that is especially important in an intellectual situation like the one in which we find ourselves, in which all the dominant currents of thought in the positive social sciences, in the normative disciplines, and in the humanities conspire against the transformative will and the transformative imagination. They are, as I have remarked before, rationalizing, humanizing, and escapist tendencies. And each in its own way severs the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible. Not the remote speculative possible, but the adjacent possible. To understand the state of affairs is always to grasp what it can become. And that is the premise that underlies our engagement with the American circumstance. Hegel wrote somewhere that philosophy, by which he meant simply thought, in its most general expression and ambition, is revolutionary, even when it appears to be reactionary. And the reason is that the activity of trying to represent a situation as a whole, rather than piecemeal, exposes its distinctiveness and its transformability. So that's the spirit in which I now make these remarks. Distinguishing the main sets of ideas that we have explored here up to now. The first set of ideas has to do with the present American circumstance. That was the prompt for the course. The present American circumstance viewed both at the superficial level and at a deeper level. At the superficial level, the situation is a momentous turn in the political life of the American people. The political party and the movements that have claimed to represent the progressive cause in the United States seem to have abandoned the interests of a large part of the working class of the country, especially the white working class, which has felt itself to be abandoned by them. And these progressive forces over the last 50 years have failed to develop a sequel to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. A project responsive to the recognized needs, interests, and aspirations of the broad working class majority of the country. Into this vacuum then steps right-wing populism. Aroused by the unmet needs and interests of this majority, and claiming to provide the alternatives that the progressives have failed to offer. But the project of this right-wing populism is a fragile project. It's fragile because it has almost no structural element. And no political project can be powerful that fails to have institutional clarity and an institutional legacy. Its economic project is simply to impose restraints on trade and to prolong the life of the declining traditional mass production industries. It has no proposal for the reorganization of the American economy in the future. Its nationalist project relies on an archaic and fanciful idea of the nation. The nation is a tribe based on sameness, an idea that is counterfactual, that does not rest on the realities of national life in the United States, rather than on a future-oriented idea of the nation as a common project. And it has no constitutional project, no project for the state at all, other than the strengthening of executive authority. Therefore, this right-wing populism, although it has taken advantage of the cue provided by the failure of the progressives, is itself fragile. And this fragility would provide an immense opportunity to the progressives if they had a project. And it seems that they do not. They have no chance of having a project if they have no conception. Now, we've also explored, or attempted to explore, a deeper view of the American circumstance. One that's less related just to the peculiarities of the present moment. Mm-hmm. The basic tragedy is one that the American people share with other advanced societies around the world. There is in the country an immense, almost anarchic vitality, a pulsating human energy widely dispersed in national life. But the vast majority of ordinary men and women experience themselves as constrained, humiliated, belittled, denied the economic and educational instruments that would be needed to transform this vitality into constructive action. And as a result, the preponderance of this vast human energy that abounds in the country goes wasted. It goes wasted because the structure, that is to say, the institutional organization of the economy, of education, and of the state, democratic politics, denies ordinary people the instruments. That's the essential tragedy. And this tragedy would require structural innovation. That would have to be the heart of any real alternative. Our ideals and interests are always nailed to the cross of the institutions and practices that represent them, in fact. The law is the site of this crucifixion. And there is no prospect of transformation without change in the institutional structure. But this institutional view of the problem and therefore of the task is incomplete. Another part of the problem is spiritual. It has to do with consciousness. And right at the beginning of the course, we evoked the message of the American prophets. The great American prophets, especially of the 19th century, such as Emerson, Whitman, and Lincoln. The core of this message is recognition of the greatness, of the godlike character of the ordinary person, and therefore of the potential for the ordinary person to ascend to a higher form of life with greater scope, larger intensity, stronger capability, to share in the attributes that we ascribe to the divine, to become more human by becoming more godlike. That's the essential creed of democracy. And it entirely transcends the limits of the political and the economic. This creed, in its canonical American expression, is not beyond criticism. Its most characteristic American expressions have been tainted. And early in the course, I suggested an account of the taint, of the limitation, of the flaw in its two sides. On the one hand, the Americans, not just the ordinary Americans, but even these prophets, have tended to understate the transformability of social life through the renovation of the institutional arrangements. The Americans have been susceptible to an institutional idolatry, to believe that they discovered early on the definitive formula of a free society. On the other hand, and this is the reverse side of the taint, they have tended to overstate the extent to which the individual can rescue himself by his own action, like the little Napoleon who crowns himself. And there has been in the American mind a disturbance in the recognition of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. So this deeper circumstance has to be somehow engaged in both its institutional and its spiritual aspects. at the same time that we deal with the immediate circumstance. A second set of ideas in the course then had as its focus an attempt to understand the genealogy, the making in history of this present circumstance. And we looked back from the present to American history to find cues for alternatives. The last great episode of institutional refoundation in the history of the United States was the New Deal. And we discussed the New Deal and its transmutations. Its beginnings in an early moment of institutional experimentalism that was already surprisingly narrow in its focus, dominated not by a program of economic empowerment or enhancement of agency, but by a program of economic restabilization in the form of what today we would call corporatism. Then its narrowing to the attempt to develop antidotes to economic insecurity. And finally, its even narrower focus on the popularization of opportunities to consume, the creation of a market in mass consumption goods, and ultimately the substitution of the project of property-owning democracy by a kind of fake credit democracy. So we shouldn't sentimentalize the New Deal. It fails to provide us with a template for the alternatives today. Then we look back to a further moment, further back in American history, the two major traditions of progressive reform in the history of the United States. The tradition of defending the little against the big, and especially small business and small property against big business, from Jefferson to Brandeis. And then the tradition which culminated in the early 20th century progressivism of accepting the domination of the commanding heights of the economy by big business, accompanied by its subjection to strong regulation by the national government. And I made the argument that both these traditions were inadequate because they failed to confront the limitations of the basic institutional organization of the economy. They failed to develop the implications of the fact that the market economy has no single natural and necessary form, and that it's not enough to regulate it or to compensate for its inequalities after the fact by progressive taxation and redistributive entitlements. It is necessary to innovate in the arrangements that define the market economy and that shape the primary, the original distribution of economic advantage and opportunity. To democratize the market rather than simply regulating it and humanizing it. And finally, we look back to the first half of the 19th century and to the dynamic that, in fact, helped build the United States. The combination of a Hamiltonian project of mobilization of national resources to build a country on top, with fragmentary democratization of the market economy in particular sectors, especially agriculture and finance. That's what really built the country. And that combination of the movement from above and from below, mobilization and democratization, although piecemeal and flawed, limited, and accompanied by the vast incubus of African slavery. That dynamic is what was later abandoned and suppressed already by the two major traditions of progressive reform. And that is what we would need to do again today, in spades, in every department of national life. Then comes a third set of themes in the argument of the course, which are the institutional alternatives today. And these institutional alternatives in our arguments were organized around three main projects. The project of democratizing the market economy, the project of equipping the individual through another form of democratic education, and the project of deepening democracy, the energizing and reorganization of democratic politics. In the first of these three projects, the project of democratizing the economy, I gave priority to three endeavors. The first and most important would be the commitment to disseminate throughout the entire economy the advanced knowledge-intensive practices of production. There is a new paradigm of production in all the advanced economies, dense in knowledge, radical in innovation and experimentalism, but on the whole it remains confined in insular vanguards from which the vast majority of the labor force is excluded. What we would want is an inclusive form of this vanguardism. And that, I argued, is possible only through institutional reconstruction of the economy, looking to another architecture of the market economy. And that architecture would include a form of decentralized strategic coordination or partnership between the government and small and medium-sized firms, and cooperative competition among these firms in the service of the dissemination of the vanguardism. The second project had to do with the relation between labor and capital. There is no progressive project that is consistent with the decline of the share of labor in national income and with the growth in the United States and in all the advanced economies of precarious labor. Labor performed under decentralized contractual arrangements that threaten to throw an increasing portion of the labor force into radical economic insecurity. Therefore, the need for a new legal regime that protects, organizes, and represents precarious labor and tilts the scales, once again, in the relation of labor to capital. The third endeavor has to do with the relation of finance to the real economy. Finance is a bad master, but it can become a good servant. I argued through a series of institutional innovations that more effectively enlist finance in the service of the productive agenda of society, rather than allowing it to serve only itself. The best way to tame finance is to make it more useful. The second major project was the project of developing a new form of democratic education that requires another pedagogic paradigm, a form of education that is focused on the analytic and synthetic capabilities that distinguish the imagination, that prefers selective depth to encyclopedic superficiality, as the context in which these capabilities are acquired, that privileges cooperation in teaching and learning over the combination of individualism and authoritarianism, and above all, that is dialectical in its approach to the received body of knowledge, teaching every field from contrasting points of view to liberate the mind. And that program can be realized both as general education and as technical education. The institutional context for that advance requires that we develop the instruments to reconcile national standards of investment in quality with the local managements of the schools. Therefore, national assessment, redistributive mechanisms from richer places to poorer places, and procedures for corrective intervention when a local school system repeatedly falls beneath the minimum acceptable threshold of quality. We cannot allow the quality of education that a young person receives to depend on the happenstance of where or to whom it is born. The third major project is the project of energizing democracy, of creating over time a form of democratic politics that can master the structure of society, that can overthrow the government of the living by the dead, and that can weaken the dependence of change on crisis. And I argued that there are three major domains of institutional innovation in which this project can be carried forward. The first has to do with the level of popular engagement in political life, that is to say, with the temperature of politics. Innovations in the financing of political activity, in the access to the means of communication, in the electoral regimes that increase the temperature. The second domain has to do with the pace of politics. Innovations, constitutional innovations, to resolve impasse between the political branches of government rapidly. For example, through early elections, to hasten the pace, rather than deliberately to perpetuate impasse. To reaffirm the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, while repudiating the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. And the third domain is the domain of the reinvention of federalism. First, through cooperative federalism, both horizontally among states and among towns, and vertically among the three levels of the federation, and then later to expand the opportunities for a part of the country to diverge from the national solutions and to create counter-models of the national future. Now, if you ask me, in the American circumstance, what the hierarchy of accessibility of change in these domains is, I would say, first, federalism. That's the easiest to accept in the United States, the reinvention of federalism. Then only second, the elevation of the temperature of politics, money and media. And only last, far into the future, a change in the basic logic of the constitutional arrangements, which is regarded as sacrosanct in the United States. Now, a fourth set of ideas then has to do with the representation of this project, defined by the three great tasks that I just described: democratizing the market, equipping the individual, and deepening democracy. Its representation as a political and social alliance. Every transformative project can be understood simultaneously in these two ways: as the creation of a coalition or a base on one side, and the creation of an institutional project on the other. The institutional project helps create over time its own constituency. a transracial progressive majority. And that transracial progressive majority has to include the precarious workers and the racially stigmatized underclass on one side, but it also crucially has to include the small business class, which the traditional left, the European left, with calamitous results, elected as its adversaries. The lifting up of the whole periphery of the economy, its structural transformation. And to create such a constituency, it's necessary to confront the two great impediments that have existed in contemporary American politics: the separation of race from class and the taking of sides in the contest of moral agendas, in which the progressives have taken the secular and modernist side against the religious and traditionalist side, when in fact both these moral agendas are primitive as forms of spiritual consciousness, and neither of them deserve support. The fifth set of ideas has to do with the transformation of consciousness. The progressive project can't be a project just of institutional change. It has to be also a project of the transformation of ideas, of sensibilities, of ways of thinking and of feeling. And there, it's necessary to confront the taint to which I referred before. The democratic prophecy of the divinity, of the greatness of the ordinary, has to be liberated from the double taint. The taint of the institutional idolatry and the taint of the failure to recognize the dependence of self-construction on solidarity. The democratic prophecy has to be criticized and transformed, not just to be venerated. Then the sixth set of ideas in the course addresses the ways of thinking that we need to carry forward a project like this, a project that depends on thought and not simply on will. The marriage of exemplary action to visionary thinking. And in my interventions, I emphasized three components in these ways of thinking. The first component is the imagination of structure, of structural discontinuity and structural alternatives in history. The dominant forms of thought in the high academic culture are bereft of structural vision. They work against the structural imagination. So we face a choice in the history of thought between traditions like the tradition of Marxist theory that have a deterministic view of structure, a small menu of systems in history, each of them indivisible and driven forward by laws. And on the other hand, the contemporary social sciences and policy discourse, which have no structural insight and naturalize the present form of social life. We have to work against both these traditions. A very important example of what is at stake has to do with what I call the binary idea of politics that comes from this Marxist tradition. On this view, all politics must be either the revolutionary substitution of one system by another or the reformist management of a system. That view denies the characteristic form of structural change, radical reform, which is piecemeal but can nevertheless be revolutionary in its outcome if it persists in a certain direction. A form of transformative practice that is gradualist, that is fragmentary, that is corrigible, that is experimentalist, can nevertheless have structural content. And that is indeed how structural change almost invariably happens in real history. The second component in these ideas has to do with agency, how we think about the agent of structural change. And I proposed a series of ideas about agency. But among those ideas, there's one that deserves emphasis. And that's the claim that there is always more than one set of ways to define and defend a group interest. There are ways to define and defend a group interest that are institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, and there are ways that are institutionally transformative and socially solidaristic. The deeper the conflict and the broader its scope, the more the question, what are my interests, as a member of a certain class or group, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the alternatives? What are the alternative ways of organizing things? And who would I be under those alternatives? And how would I come to reinterpret my interests and even my identity? The third component in these ways of thinking relates to the way in which we deal with the experience of the individual participating in a collective struggle. The individual, as I argued, living in biographical time, whereas the collective task advances in historical time, beyond the scope of his own life. And there I want to emphasize the claim that there are two perversions that we must avoid simultaneously. One perversion is to treat individual existence, the existence of the individual activist, as simply an instrument of the collective project. A form of dehumanization which invariably sets us up for illusion and self-deception. The other perversion is to treat our political activity as an occasion for romantic adventurism, in which the transformation of collective life becomes simply a pretext for self-transformation. And I argued that in seeking to avoid both these perversions, we must play on the affinity between our interest in defying the structure of society and our stake in defying the rigidified form of our own selves. Our character, the mummy that begins to form around us and that prevents us from achieving what should be our goal of dying only once. Transformative practice requires vulnerability, and vulnerability helps to destroy the mummy. We have a moral interest in this experience, which allows us to engage in good faith without treating the individual life as simply an instrument of the collective task. So there you have a very simple map from my point of view of the arguments of the course. Overshadowing all of this is the idea of the primacy of the prophetic impulse. The imagination of the future. Living for the future as a way of living in the present. As a way of living in the present as a being not determined by the present circumstances of his existence, but accompanied by the conviction that there's never a clear distinction between real prophets and false prophets, and that the prophetic message must itself always be subject to testing and to criticism. A continuing inspiration in these arguments is the activity and the teaching of the American prophets. And of the many calamities that have befallen the American Republic, none may be more onerous than the silence of the prophetic voice. An incitement to our effort here in this course is our shared conviction that the prophetic voice can and should break its silence and speak again. So we have time now for discussion.
Absolutely. I think we'll just let those words linger for a little while. Rich, capacious, challenging. Indeed, indeed. Questions, Jacob?
Yes. My point about the pace of politics. Yes. Yes. Correct. Well, I know that this is a point. So the question is, I interpret it as a question about the relation between the hastening of the pace of politics, the rapid resolution of impasse, and the safeguards of democracy, and in particular the safeguards of rights. Now, this is a point that has already provoked debate among us, and I know that it is a point that is in particular controversial and difficult in the United States because of the dominant forms of political thinking in the United States. So let me once again give my view of it. In the American constitutional architecture, there are two main generative principles. There is a liberal principle of the fragmentation of power, that power should have many different sources and agents. It should not be concentrated. And then there's a conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. That's part of the Madisonian scheme. And in general, the Madisonian scheme establishes a kind of table of correspondences between the transformative reach of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles that it has to overcome. And the result of this table of correspondences is that the system is designed in such a way that change, fundamental change through politics, is almost impossible unless there is crisis. Let's take the example of Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt had two allies, much more important than his political allies: the Depression and the war. And even then, he had trouble. And he had trouble because the constitutional system was designed to give him trouble, to inhibit the political transformation of society. And the traditional justification is that that is an indispensable safeguard against political despotism, the concentration of power. That's how the Americans think. They think that there is a natural and necessary connection between the liberal principle of the fragmentation of power and the conservative principle of the slowing down of politics. I believe that they are mistaken, that there is no such natural and necessary connection between these two principles, and that it is possible to reaffirm and strengthen the liberal principle while repudiating and replacing the conservative one by constitutional arrangements that rapidly resolve impasse. For example, I gave an example of, make a long list of ways to do it. There's not one way to do it. So one way to do it under a presidential regime is when there is a stalemate, an impasse between the two political branches. Either of the two branches unilaterally enjoys the constitutional prerogative of calling early elections to resolve the impasse, but the elections must always be bilateral for both branches, so that the branch that exercises the constitutional prerogative has to pay the political price of running the electoral risk. That's a simple example of how, by a relatively modest innovation, you can turn the political logic of the presidential regime upside down and transform it into a machine for the acceleration of politics. Nothing in that contradicts the safeguards of the individual. They can be enhanced. They can be enhanced through more rights, a social inheritance, basic endowments, a package of resources that every citizen would have. And with the reinvention of federalism, greater facilities for parts of the country under certain conditions to secede from the general arrangements and create counter models of the national future. That is, the defense of freedom and of political pluralism should not depend on the stagnation of politics. That's the point that's in debate. Yes. You mean in this program that I outlined, what are the initial steps? Well, I have to say that I believe that the judgment of the initial steps is always circumstantial. So, starting with the political program of energizing democracy, I said what I think the initial steps are. I said that of those three domains of transformation, the one that is most appealing and attractive in the United States is the third one, the reinvention of federalism, because it's not just a left cause. It's a cause that can appeal to conservatives from the standpoint of their tradition of states' rights. They can understand it as a proposal of energizing decentralization. Now, if you take then the second domain, education, it has very wide appeal in the United States. And a natural place to begin is to challenge the severe educational dualism that exists in the United States. So there's a top tier of private schools and of the specialized or public schools, or the public schools in rich parts of the country. And then there's the rest. The top tier is informed by a truncated version of John Dewey's program. John Dewey was one of the American prophets and the leading educational reformer in the history of the United States. So they cut John Dewey's program in half. They accepted the half about analysis and dialogue, and they rejected the half about criticism. And they transformed this elite education in the United States into a way of preparing people for the modus operandi in the professional business class in the country. You talk everything through. and you learn the argumentative and analytic discourse. So what I would say is reject the truncation, radicalize the program, but above all, attack the educational dualism. That is, don't have a large mass of public schools designed to train students for obedience, for sullen obedience and conformity in a kind of factory or office that no longer exists. That's something that can have wide appeal in the United States. That's another point of departure.
Right. That's right.
Then we come to the economic part. So I cited those three projects in the economic part. One of them was to overcome the insularity of the vanguard through what would traditionally be described as industrial policy. Now, every governor in the United States is trying to have an industrial policy, including all of the Republican governors. But their ideas are primitive. So they think, well, we'd like to have a Silicon Valley also. So let's drop it down by parachute like a little Potemkin village. And it's because they don't have another idea. They don't know how to do it. But the attempt in itself to develop a more inclusive form of vanguardism is widely appealing. And it can be worked on practically. That's what Americans are good at. They're good at cooperation. They're good at practical ingenuity. They don't like ideological dogma. And they've demonstrated in their national history that when they need to, as in the war economy, they do whatever they need to do, regardless of the ideological and institutional dogmas. So let's take advantage of that. And that too, each of those three examples in those three areas are examples of developing a project that can represent the initial steps of such a structural transformation, being winning over or helping to create a broad base, this transracial progressive majority, and appealing to elements of the right as well as of the left. Now, that's not what's happened in the United States. So what's happened in the United States is that the self-appointed representatives of the progressive cause are habituated to sacrifice transformative effects to progressive pieties. Example, every time in the electoral cycle, they come out with their proposals for progressive taxation. They know that progressive taxation has an entirely marginal effect on the distribution of economic advantage. And that even from the standpoint of the budget, what matters most in the short term is not the progressive profile of taxation on the revenue-raising side. It's the aggregate tax take and how it's spent. But they genuflect to these progressive pieties as a way of symbolizing whose side they are, even though they know that this has a marginal effect. And it then serves as a proxy for the structural project that they lack. These Pharisees have to be unmasked. And we have to, the American progressives have to attack them and have to develop patiently, piecemeal, cumulatively, the progressive alternative that the country lacks. And it's easy to identify in each of these areas what the most plausible first steps are, so long as we have a view of the direction. If we have no view of the direction, we have no chance of exploring initial steps. Yes. Correct. Yes. Well, an important element of this project, and you're entirely right. So the question is, what about the losers? And specifically, what about the losers in the sense of those who, for whatever reason, cannot share in even an inclusive form of the knowledge economy? Mm-hmm. So I would say an important objective is the development of a universal social endowment, a basic set of minimum resources that are guaranteed to every individual. The minimum guaranteed income is only one of the many forms or aspects. So, for example, the individual should have a package of resources and opportunities on which he can draw in the course of his life to change careers, to change direction, to learn new tricks, to develop new skills, and not to be confined to the trajectory that, for whatever accidental reason or series of constraints, he chose early in his formation. So that would be another side of the same idea. But your question also touches on yet another issue, which we didn't explore here yet, at least, which is the practical basis of social solidarity. So take the institutionally conservative European social democracies. In those social democracies, more egalitarian than the United States, the practical basis of social solidarity are money transfers organized by the state. The state has a big tax take, and then it uses this tax take to redistribute, to employ people, to take care of other people. And that happened in Europe against the background of a very high level of ethnic and cultural homogeneity. Now that the cultural and ethnic homogeneity is diminishing, the insufficiency of money as a social cement is exposed. Money is not a sufficient basis of social solidarity. The only adequate practical basis of social solidarity is direct engagement with other people beyond the boundaries of family selfishness. So another progressive principle or idea is that every able-bodied adult should, in principle, have at least two positions. He should have a position in the production system, in the division of labor, in production, in his work, in his profession, but he should have also a second position helping to take care of other people beyond the boundaries of his own family. And there are different ways of organizing that. As part of the working year, or as part of a life of social service, even mandatory social service, national service, as a substitute for mandatory military service, and also expressing the same Republican conception that is expressed in the idea of mandatory military service. The army is the nation in arms, and not a part of the nation paid for by the other parts to defend them. And the nation takes care of itself. Everyone takes care of everyone. That's the practical basis of social solidarity. And that's another part of the answer to your question about the losers. So we take the side of the losers. The only way is not through just the sacrifice of money, by taxation or by philanthropy, but also by the sacrifice of what matters most, which is time. Time is our supreme resource. And it is in the use of time that we demonstrate who we are, much more than in the use of money. Now, Cornell, I also want to hear you on my summary. And
On your whole argument?
well, yeah, not on my whole argument, not on all the substantive points, but on the kind of approach that it represents.
Yeah. Well, maybe actually we can just highlight that a bit next week. What's fascinating is the degree to which Brother Roberto and I have very similar radical democratic sensibilities. We have very similar Emersonian grounds, but we have different trajectories. And I say that in this way, that he is in no way a Hegelian because he's always concerned about the future. And for Hegel, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings upon the falling of the dust. It looks retrospective. But he's got a certain Hegelian sensibility in terms of his architectonic structure. Whereas I'm Coltranean, which is radically different. Or even Kierkegaardian if you want to go European. And what I mean by that is...
Well, you remember that Friedrich Schlegel said, two things are fatal to the mind. One is to have a system and the other is not to have a system.
I know that one too, and that's a slippery tightrope to walk, absolutely. So that you do want to have some direction. You want to have some provisional, tentative telos, some end and aim, yes. But keep in mind, for Brother Roberto, he's experimental all the way down, even given his radical democratic convictions. I'm contingent all the way down too. But when I say Coltranean, what I mean is that when Coltrane says, Johnny Hartman, show up at the studio, we're going to do a production. And Johnny said, what we singing? I don't know yet. Or show up December 1964, we're going to do Love Supreme. And Elvis say, well, what does it sound like? I don't know yet. Just show up, brother. And just follow. And in that sense, there's a certain falling back on the best of one's tradition, even though it accents an instantaneous and spontaneous performance, but the performance is predicated on unbelievable discipline and mastery of craft. And what's fascinating, I think so much of the fun of the course that we've been able to do for now almost 20 years back and forth is the dialectical interplay between some of those differences. So I think fundamentally I would begin with the notion of deep agreement. And I think when I come to disagreements, it would be this sense of not highlighting the overwhelming obstacles and impediments that have to be part and parcel of the diagnosis to both sustain the citizenry, sustain the person, and most importantly, to keep the best of the tradition alive. And I can see Brother Roberto come back to me and say, no, but Brother West, if you become too preoccupied with the obstacles and the impediments, you can fall right into the neoliberal trap. And the neoliberal argument is always against the visionary. It's not possible. Let's adjust ourselves and adapt ourselves to the present order. It's the best we can do. Sorry about that. Have a drink and some coffee. And that's real. We've been dealing with that in the progressive camp for a long time. And so I think once we move out, no, we only got 30 seconds. But once we move into next week, we might be able to flesh.
But let me say something about that.
Absolutely.
Because in these last two classes that we have now, we very much want to devote much of the time to discussion of your ideas,
yes,
and including the ideas that you might be writing about.
Absolutely.
But for our discussion to be useful, it's very important that you make an effort to come prepared with comments, with interventions. They don't have to be just questions addressed to us. They can be proposals of a different line of argument, of a different interpretation of the American circumstance, or a different attitude to the response. But so that's an assignment in addition to the writing assignment, that you come to these last two classes with an agenda. And if you're in a discussion section, as an undergraduate, maybe you could work in these sections collectively to bring these questions or proposals to the courts. And that would greatly add to the interest of the time that we have. The time is running out, which is what always happens with the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was wonderful.